Hey guys, and welcome to another one of my tutorials. So in this video, I'll be showing you how to set up a spatially based inventory system like you see right here. So before we go ahead and jump into it, let me just kind of explain what it is and how exactly it will look when we're totally finished. So if you don't know what a spatially based inventory system is, it's basically like the system that they use inside of games like Escape from Tarkov and Resident Evil. So you can drag items around inside of your inventory and you can place them wherever you want as long as they don't overlap with something else. So if I try to drag this knife on top of this AK-47, you can see it shows red. And if I drop it here, it's going to default back to like the top left corner of the inventory. You can also rotate items. So if I take this and I press R, it will rotate it. So you can either have it horizontal or vertical. And of course, it knows if it doesn't fit. So if I rotate this gun, it doesn't fit at all anywhere. And so if I try to drop it, it will default back to the best location that it can find. And it's also pretty smart about walking over items. So you can see if I close it, there's a grenade on the ground right here. If I go over and walk over it, it adds it to the top left corner. But if there's something already there, so let me put this knife up here, and then I'm going to drop this grenade by just dragging it out here. And then if I pick it up again, you can see it now populates it into this tile right here because that's the next available one. And likewise with these AKs, if I don't have any room and I walk over them, it won't pick them up. But if I make some room, so let's just move this, and then I walk over one, you can see now it picks it up. But if I try to walk over another one, it doesn't because there's no room. So that's basically the way the inventory system functions. And yeah, so you can also drop items like I was showing you before by dragging them out. And then one other thing I kind of want to point out about this that's really neat is how easy it is to like manipulate and adjust the settings. So once we have it all finished, you'll basically be able to click on the inventory component, which we're going to be creating, and simply change the number of columns and rows over here on the details panel. So right now I have it set to 6 by 15, but if you wanted to change it to like 10 by 4, you could easily do that. And so now if we run it, you can see it's now 10 by 4, and things will adjust accordingly. The other thing that's pretty cool about this is that it's inside of a component. So if you had like a crate in your game or like a store that you wanted to have this type of inventory system, you could just add the inventory component to it and it would work. And then the last thing I want to point out that's pretty cool is that you can very easily change the size of items. So if I open up my grenade, for example, you can see when you construct an item, you can just simply specify the dimensions. So I'm going to change it from 1 by 1 to 2 by 2 and then hit play. And you'll see when I pick up grenades now, they're now 2 by 2 instead of 1 by 1. So yeah, that's pretty much all the functionality that's supported by what we're about to do. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. So I'm going to open up the Epic Game Launcher because we're going to be doing this totally from scratch. And I'm on version 4.25.3. So I always recommend being on that one or newer, just to avoid any potential issues. And then we're going to select games and then hit next. And then we want to do the third person template and then hit next. And then we want blueprints and we don't need any starter content, so we can just leave that. And I'm just going to call this spatial inventory. Inventory, and then go ahead and create the project. Now while this is loading, I just want to say that this is probably going to be the longest tutorial that I've ever done because it's pretty, I don't want to say complicated, but there's a lot of little pieces to it and it is quite involved, let's just put it that way. So bear with me if it takes a while, but you'll definitely learn a lot if you actually follow through it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is create the inventory widget that shows up on the screen and get like the grid showing on the right. And then after that, we'll like start working on the items. So let's come back here to the content folder. And inside of here, let's make a new folder and call it inventory. So right click and make a new folder, call it inventory. And I'm just going to click this little button over here to show this section because I like it. And then inside of here, let's add the stuff we're going to need. So we're going to add the classes and the widgets that we need. We're going to add all of them real quick because I think it's a little bit easier to just have them. And then once we have them all, we'll go and we'll start filling them out. So the first thing we need is the inventory widget itself. So right click and go to user interfaces. And we want to create a widget blueprint. So select that guy. And then we want to call it inventory components, or inventory widget. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. Inventory underscore widget. And then the next thing we want is the inventory component. So right click and go to blueprint class and create a new actor component. Make sure you select actor component and not actor, and call it inventory component. And then the next one we want is another widget. So right click, say user interface, widget blueprint, and we will call this the inventory grid widget. So this one's going to be specifically for the grid section of the inventory. And then the next one we want is another widget. So right click, user interface, widget blueprint, and this is going to be for the item itself. So we'll call this item underscore widget. And then the last, we need 3 more things. So we need 2 structures just to kind of make things a little bit more organized. So to create a structure, you just right click, go to blueprints, and then go to structure. And we will call this line. And we're going to be using this structure to help us draw the lines that make up the grid. So let's just open this up real quick and fill it out because it's going to be really simple. Why is it not? Come on, open up. There we go. So inside of here, we just want to create a start point and an end point. So I'm going to change this guy to, if you search for a vector 2D, we want that. And if you don't know what a vector 2D is, it's just basically a float with 2 values. So it's an X and a Y value. And we will call this the start. And then make one more new variable and call it end. So it's going to be the start point of our line and the end point of our line. We can just save that, and then we can close this. And then let's come back here. The next thing we need is another structure for a tile. So right click, blueprints, structure, and call it tile. And this is basically going to represent a specific tile inside of the grid, so it needs to have an X and a Y coordinate. So open this guy up, and then change this to integer, and call it X, and then make a new variable, and call it Y, and make sure it's set to integer as well. And then we can close that. And then the very final thing we need here is a slate brush. And I'll come back to why we actually need this probably towards the end when we actually use it. But for now, let's just go ahead and create it so we don't have to do it later. So to do that, we're going to right click and go to user interfaces and make a slate brush. And I'm just going to call it SB for slate brush underscore color. And we actually don't need to change anything about this. We just need it to exist so that we can use it. So yeah, now we can save all and we can get started. So these are everything we need for the inventory side of things. So like I said, the first thing we want to do here is create it so that when we press the I button, for example, it opens up our inventory. So let's go into our project settings. So you go to edit project settings. And let's add a new input binding. So come down here and select input. And then up under action mappings, we want to expand this. And we want to add one, so hit the little plus button, and we're going to call it toggle inventory, and we will set it to I, and you can set it to whatever you want, obviously, but for my tutorial, I'm going to set it to the I key. So there we go. And so now we need to hook it up inside of the player so that when the player presses this key, the inventory will open. So go to your player, whatever your player is in your project. I'm going to go to the third person character blueprint, and open this guy up. And so what we want to do is down here at the bottom, we want to listen for that toggle event. So if we right click and we search for toggle inventory, it will show up with that event. And we want to basically show the widget if it's not already shown, or we want to hide the widget if it is being shown. So before we can fill this out, we need to actually create the widget. And I'm going to do that inside of begin play. So real quick, we're going to come back up here. We don't actually have a begin play yet, so we're going to add one. So I'm going to right click and say begin play. And so what we want to do right here is we just want to create the widget. So if we right click and say create widget, and make sure you use create widget and not construct object. I see a lot of people who follow my tutorials mess this up and they use construct object instead of create widget, and then it doesn't work. So make sure you use create widget here and hook that up. And so for the class, we want to select our inventory widget. Make sure you select inventory widget. And the owning player is going to be our player controller. So we can say get self, get controller, and then we just want to cast this to a player controller. So we'll say cast to player controller. And then I'm going to right click and convert this to a pure cast. And that is going to be our owning player. And then we want to take this and we want to promote it to a variable. So if you right click right here on return value and say promote to variable, it will create a variable for us. And we want to call this the inventory component. Okay, so now that we have the inventory component being created, we can come back down here. And like I said before, we want to check if it's currently visible. And if it is, then we want to hide it. And if it's not currently visible, then we want to show it. We basically want to flip the state of it. So let's drag this guy in, and we will say is in viewport. So this is going to return whether or not it's currently being shown. And we will do a branch like this. And so if it is currently being shown, it's going to go to true. And so in that case, we want to remove it. So we will say inventory component remove from parent, which will remove it from the viewport. And then we want to set the input mode back to game only, because when we show it, we're going to set the input mode to game and UI only. So maybe we should do the false first, so it makes more sense. So if it's false, then that means we want to show it. So let's just do that first. So we'll drag this guy in and we'll say add to viewport. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to set the game mode to UI and game, or game and UI, I think it's called. So we can right click and say set input mode game and UI, like so. And this again wants the player controller. So I think actually instead of doing that whole list of stuff I did before, let's just go back up here to begin play. And let's take all of this and right click and say collapse to function. And we will just call this get player controller. And then let's just come in here real quick. So this looks fine. But let's change it to be pure and const so we don't have to use the execution pins, and then compile and save. And I'm going to click on this guy and add it to a private category as well, just because it's private, and then also set it to private as well. So it should look like this. You have private, private, checkbox for pure, and checkbox for constant. And that will make our lives a little bit easier. So now we can come back here to the event graph, and you can see it's cleaned up this code a good bit. And we also want to do the same thing down here. So we can just say get player controller and plug that into the player controller. The widget we want to focus is going to be our inventory component. So drag that in. Oh wait, this shouldn't be called inventory component. Sorry, this should be called inventory widget. I don't know why I named it component. So rename this to inventory widget. Sorry. All right, so the widget we want to show is our inventory widget. So let's hook that up. You can set this mouse locking to be whatever you want. This is just how the mouse behaves. And then we want to uncheck hide cursor during capture because we don't want the cursor to be hidden. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to drag in our get player controller again, and then drag off of this and say set mouse cursor, or set show mouse cursor rather. And we want to set this to be true. So make sure you select true. So that way the mouse shows whenever we are inside of the inventory. So there we go. So that's what we need to do to show it. We just add it to the viewport, set the game mode to UI only, or set the input mode to game and UI, and then we show the mouse cursor. So when we're hiding it, we basically need to do the opposite of that. So the opposite of that is we remove it, and then we need to set the game mode back to game only. So we can drag in our player controller, and we can say set input mode game only. And then finally, we want to show mouse cursor and set it to false. So we're just going to copy this, paste, and say false. Okay, so now this code should be working, but we can't really test it yet because the inventory widget doesn't have anything inside of it, so we won't be able to see it. So let's go back to our inventory widget. So come back to the main content folder, and then inside of inventory, we want to open up the inventory widget. So open this guy up, and let me open it up on my other screen as well, just so I can reference it here. All right, so this screen is basically going to be um, the widget that covers the entire screen. So if you noticed from my other video that I showed at the beginning, it kind of darkened the screen, it blurred it out a little bit, and then on the right side it had the inventory. So that's what the responsibility of this widget is to show like the whole background and blur it out, and then to show this little grid over here. So to do that, we need to add a background border to the whole thing. So up here at the top left, search for border, and we want to drag this guy in. And then I'm going to rename this, so I'm just going to hit F2 and call it the background border, just so we know what it is. And then we want to set the anchor point to be expanded, and then we want to zero out the offset right and the offset bottom so that it actually covers the whole screen. And then after that, we want to come down here and we want to find the brush color, and we want to change this to some dark color. So let's click on this, and I'm going to set it to 0, 0, 0 for just totally black, and then give it an opacity of like 0.2 so that it just has a kind of a dark tint to it. And then I think also I added a blur, so let's just search for blur and drag that guy onto the background border. And then if you select the background blur itself, you can find the blur strength and set it to whatever you want. I think I set it to 2, so now you can kind of see that it's blurring out the background, which looks nice. Obviously you don't need this, just to make it look nicer, I think. And then the main thing we want to add here is, of course, the grid on the right. So the grid on the right is contained, or it's going to be contained inside of the inventory grid widget. So all we're going to do is we're going to come up here and say inventory grid widget, and we want to add that, and make sure you add it to the canvas panel. So drag it on top of the canvas panel. And you can see by default it adds it kind of up here at the top left. So what we want to do is we want to change the anchor point to be on the right side of the screen. So we want to select this one. And then we want to zero out the position X and the position Y. And then I'm going to set the size to be like 100 by 500. But I just want to point out real quick that whatever size you put here doesn't matter because we're going to be overwriting it later. But just so you can kind of visualize what's going on, I'm going to set it to 100 by 500 so we can kind of see it for right now. And then the alignment, we need to set to actually 1 on the X and then 0.5 on the Y, so that way it's centered. And then maybe let's actually add or subtract, so let's do -50 for the position X, so it kind of bumps it off from hugging the right side of the screen. So you can kind of see what's going on here. And we'll want to select size to content as well, and you can see when we do that, it hides it. And that's because the actual size of this inventory grid widget is like 0, 0 because we haven't created it yet. But again, once we create it, it will look correct. So for right now, we just need to select this, make sure it looks like this, and then select it. And it will show up later once we actually go and we fill out that widget. But it's fine that it doesn't show it. Okay, so I think that's everything we need to do on this tab at least. So let's come over here next to our inventory grid widget. So if we select the edit inventory grid widget at the top right here, you need to have this guy selected in order to see this. So select this guy and it will open up the inventory grid widget. So this is the one, like I was saying before, that's going to be responsible for drawing the actual grid itself. So we need to fill this out. So just like we did before, let's add a border to start with. So drag in a border on top of the canvas panel. And then we want to select this border, and we want to make this a variable so we can reference it. So select is variable, and then let's rename it to something more meaningful. Let's call it the grid border. And we want to set the anchor point to be in the center of the screen. And then we want to set the position to 0, 0. And the size we can set to like 150 by 600. Again, this size will be overwritten later in code, actually. So it doesn't really matter what you put here, but it's good to have something here just so you can kind of visualize what's going on. And we want to set the alignment to 0.5 and 0.5. Oops, 0.5, 0.5, so that way it's centered. We do not want to select sized content here. We'll be doing it a different way for this one, so we can just leave that unchecked. And then finally, we want to set the color of it. So let's see, if we come down here to brush color, oh, actually we want to set the padding to 0. So if you just select all this and say 0, it will set it all to 0 because we don't want any padding. And then for the brush color, if we select this guy, we want to set it to like 0, 0, 0, and 0.25, just so it's kind of has a dark tint to it as well. Obviously, you can adjust these values to make it look how you want, but I recommend just doing the ones I do for right now until we're totally done, and then you can adjust it at the end. Okay, and then finally, the last thing we need inside of here is another canvas panel. So let's come up here and say canvas panel, and we want to drag that on top of the grid border, just like so. And then I don't think there's anything we need to do here. I'm just double checking my other project. Oh, there is one thing. We need to make it a variable. So select is variable, and we want to call it the grid canvas panel, just so it has something more meaningful for a name. And then I think that might be it. I'm just double checking my other project real quick. Yeah, okay, I think that's it for right now for this guy. And so inside of here, we basically want to, in the graph tab, we basically want to draw a grid depending on the size of our inventory. And if you come back here to the inventory widget now, you can see this now has a size to it because it's using this widget. So it's basically taking this widget and it's drawing it on this screen. So whatever we do inside of here will show up right here. Okay, so let's start drawing our grid, which is actually the first thing we need to do. So let's go to the graph tab. All right, okay, so let's start with the initialize function. So let's come over here to the left and add a function and call it initialize. And so for this function, we need to take in the inventory component that it's representing. So make a new parameter, change the type to be inventory component, and then change the name of it to be inventory component. And then we also want it to take in the tile size. So new parameter, make it a float, and call it tile size. This is one thing I probably should have showed at the beginning, but let me just run my other project real quick. So you can see that the tiles have a specific size to them. I think they're 50 by 50 right now, but it's set up so that you can very easily change that. So let me just drag over my other project for 1 second. So if you were to open up your third person character once we get it all done, and then you can see it's setting it to 50, we could easily change it to like 100, for example, and then run it. And you can see they'd be 100 by 100, and all the items would update accordingly to be the correct size. So it's very easy to change the tile size as well. I kind of forgot to mention that, but I just wanted to point that out. So that's what that variable is. It's the size of each tile. Back to where I was. Okay, so we want to take this variable and we want to save it. So right click, promote to variable, and we will call this the inventory component. And it's very important, a lot of people don't do this, but it's very important to keep your variables organized and set up correctly. So we are going to do that in this tutorial. So we want to set this guy to private so that nobody else can access it. And then we want to add it to, well, it's okay, it's already in the components category, I guess that's fine, but we want to set it to private. And we want to do the same thing for tile size, so right click, promote to variable, and then I'm just going to drag this around so it's a little neater. And then we want to make this one private as well, so click this guy. First of all, rename it to tile size, and we want to set it to private, and we want to add it to a private category as well, just like so. Okay, so now that we have the inventory component and the tile size saved, the next thing we need to do is to set the actual size of our widget to be the correct size, because obviously if they pass in a larger tile size, we're going to need to be much larger. If they pass in a smaller one, we're going to be smaller. But we also want to change our size depending on how many rows and columns there are inside of the inventory component. So before we can finish writing this, we need to go back to our inventory component and add a rows and columns variable. So let's go to our inventory component, open this guy up. And let me open it up on my other screen too, just so I don't mess anything up. Okay, so over here on the left, we want to add a variable and call it columns. And we want to set this to be an integer. So this is basically how many columns there are. And we want to select the variable, and then we want to set it to instance editable, so we can edit it per instance of the inventory system. We want to set it to blueprint read only, so that way it is constant. And then we want to set it to expose on spawn as well, so that way if we were to spawn one of these through blueprints, we'd be able to edit that variable. And then we also want to add it to a constants category since it's constant, so we'll add it to a constant category. And then we want to do the same thing for rows, so we can just duplicate this and call it rows, and it will copy over all the settings for us, which is pretty nice. And so that's really all we need to do for right now. We can come back and set these up later, but we just need these variables to exist. So let's come back over here to our inventory grid widget, and we want to do a little bit of math to figure out the size of our grid. So essentially, the size of our grid needs to be set inside of our grid border. So if we drag in our grid border, we can say slot to, or slot as canvas slot, and this will allow us to change the size of it. And we want to say set size. And so whatever size we pass here is going to be the size of the border. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and split this guy up into an X and a Y. So the X is going to be the number of columns times the tile size. So we can drag in our inventory component and say get columns. And then we want to multiply this by the tile size. So we'll say float times and pass in our tile size. And that's going to be our X. And we want to do the same thing for the Y, except using rows. So I'm just going to copy all of this, paste, and then I'm going to drag in, or delete the columns rather, and say rows instead, and hook that up, and oops, and hook that up. Okay, so now we have the correct size. The next thing we need to do is create the line. So I'm going to make a little function for this because it's going to be a good amount of stuff. So I'm going to, over here on the left, create a function and call it create line segments. And we actually want to add this to a private category as well. So we'll say private and put it inside of the private category. And again, I'm just doing this to stay organized because nobody else needs access to this function. And so inside of here, we're going to be doing the magic to create the lines. So we're not actually create the lines, but at least figure out the math for where the lines need to go. We'll be drawing them in a slightly different spot. So we want to do, we want to separate this into two sections. We want to separate it into the vertical lines and the horizontal lines. So I'm going to add a sequence node. So you can do that by holding down the S on your keyboard and then left clicking, and it will create a sequence. You can also create one by right clicking and searching for sequence, like so. And so we want to basically loop over the number of columns and add a vertical line per column. So drag in our inventory component again, and we will say get columns. And then we want to do a for loop. So right click and say for loop, and make sure you select for loop and not for each loop. So we want for loop. And we're going to hook that up to the bin. Just going to organize this a little bit better. And so the columns is going to go into the last index. So we're basically going from 0 to the number of columns. And for each one of these, we want to draw a line that goes from the top to the bottom of the inventory. So we want to take the index, which is the current value of the for loop, and multiply it by the tile size. So float times the tile size, and that's how far it needs to move over. And I'm just going to make this a local variable. So right click, promote to local variable, and we will call it the X, and then in parentheses local, just to signify it's a local variable. And then we'll hook that up. So this is where it needs to start on the X. And so we basically want to make a line that starts here and then goes down and ends at the bottom of the grid. So in order to do this, we need to keep track of all of our lines, and we need a variable to do that. So over here on the left, let's add a variable, and we will call it lines. And for the type, we want to use our line structure. So if you search for line, you should see the line structure that we created earlier. And we want this to obviously be private so that nobody else can access it. And then I'm going to drag it into the private category like so. Okay, so we want to drag this guy in, and we want to say, oh wait, we need to change it to an array first. So select this guy and change it to an array, because this is a list or an array of all of our lines. So we want to drag this guy in and say add, and then we can hook this up. So our line is going to consist of 2 points. So we're going to say make line, and that will allow us to specify both of the points, the start and the end. And then I'm going to go ahead and split these guys up. So split and split. So for the starting location on the x, it's going to be our local x. So I'm just going to drag in this local variable like so. I guess I can't do that. Drag it in here, say get, hook it up. The start y is just going to be 0. The end is going to be also this value, so we can drag that in as well. And then for the end y, it needs to be the bottom of the grid, so we need to use the number of rows times the tile size. So let's just drag our inventory, or sorry, copy this guy, copy, paste, and say get rows. And then we're going to multiply this by the tile size. So we'll say float times, and then pass in the tile size. So that will be the bottom of our grid for the y. And so this is now our line, so we can hook that up to this guy. So just organize this a little bit. Okay, so these are our vertical lines that are getting created. So I'm just going to highlight this, press C to add a comment, and say create vertical lines. And then we want to do pretty much the same thing except for the horizontal lines. So down here, I guess we can just copy this. Just be careful that you follow along exactly as I do so you don't mess anything up. But we're going to copy and paste this and then modify it. So copy and paste that and then hook it up to the then one node. Except we want to change it. So instead of columns here, we want to delete this and we want to use rows, because this time we're doing the horizontal lines. And then hook that up to the last index. And then we want to change this to be local y. So I'm going to actually delete this and then right click and say promote to local variable. And then hook this up again. And then this new one I'm going to call y local, like so. And then we want to replace, actually let's just delete these. And so for the x, we want to leave it as 0. And then for the y, we want to use our local y. And for the end, we also want to use our local y. So let's plug in local y. But for the end x, we want to use this guy, except we want to change columns to rows this time. So change this to columns like so, and hook that up to the x. Something like this is what we want. So make sure it matches. You have y going into here, you have this section going into here, and then y going into here as well. And then we add it to our lines, which is good. Okay, and so let's add a little comment around this, and we will call it create horizontal lines, like so. All right, so as you can see here, just kind of recap, all we're really doing is we're creating all of our vertical lines and we're adding them to this array of lines. So we're not actually drawing the lines, we're just creating the lines, like the data for the lines. And so we need to actually draw these lines. And in order to do that, in order to draw a line on the HUD, we need to use the paint. I think it's called paint, the paint event. So if we come over here on the left and we search under overrides for the on paint event, we want to add this one. And the reason we're doing this is because the on paint event is going to let us draw lines, just like straight up lines on our graph or on our HUD, which is what we want. So inside of here, we're going to make use of that lines array that we just created. So in order to do this, we're going to break it down into 2 sections. So let's add a sequence node and hook this up. So the first thing we want to do here is we want to draw the grid itself, and then Actually, that's pretty much the only thing we're going to do right now. We're going to come back and do the other section later. I just looked at it on my other screen. But so yeah, so really the only thing we want to do right now is actually draw the lines. So it's going to be pretty straightforward. We want to drag in these lines that we created earlier, and we want to loop over them. So we'll say for each loop. And so for each line, we want to eventually call this function called draw line. So if you search for draw line, it will pop up. And it's asking you for a context, and the context is actually passed in here. So we can just drag off of this and say context, and it will show up. And so all we need to do is pass in the position A and the position B and a color. So so essentially we want to just use the values that are inside of the lines array as the position A and B. So this is the start and the end, but we need to add to it the top left corner of the border because it needs to be inside of that border. So if we drag in our border, we can say get cached geometry, which will get us the actual geometry of the thing, and we can use this handy function called get top left, which will get us the top left corner. We basically want to add this to each one of these lines. So if we right click this array element, we can split it, and that will split it apart into the start and the end. And so we want to say start, and we want to say vector 2D plus vector 2D, and we want to add the top left like so. And then I'm just going to copy and paste this node because we want to do the same thing for the end. So take that and add this as well. And so this is going to go into our position A, and this is going to go into our position B. And then you can set the tint to be basically whatever you want. So this is going to be the color of your lines inside of your grid. So I think I used 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, and 0.5. So it's like a semi-transparent gray color. And then we don't want to change any of this. Well, I mean, you can if you want. You can change the thickness or you can turn off anti-aliasing. I think these settings are probably pretty good though. And so yeah, that's basically all we want to do. Again, we'll come back to this function later and fill out this second part. But for right now, what we're going to do is just kind of set things up. So let's move this return node over here and move all of this. Oops, did not want to go inside of there. Move all of this over. Oops, messing up. Move all of this over here a little bit. And so we're essentially going to be doing one more thing here. So I'm just going to set this up and we'll fill it out later. So I'm going to add our little reroute node, and then we'll add a little comment box here. And so the thing that we're going to be doing later in the tutorial at this section is draw the drop location. So this is going to be the drop location of where we are currently holding an item. And again, we'll do this later. And then the third thing we want to do is the actual return. So hook up the return to the then to. Okay, so this kind of sets us up for later, but we don't need to do that right now because it's not needed. All right, and so now I think we need to actually come back here to our initialize function and make sure that this is getting called. Let me see my other project. Yes, okay, so after set size, we want to call our create line segments and hook that up. And then now that we have this set up, we need to actually let me look at my other code to figure out what we should do next. Create item widget. I think this is all we need to do for right now in order to get this to work. So let's actually go ahead and run this and see what it shows. So if we press play at the top and we press I, you see it shows our inventory, but it doesn't show the grid. And I think that's because we forgot to set the actual rows and columns. So let's come back here to our third person character, and up here at the top where we create the inventory widget, if we just right click and refresh this, oh, maybe it didn't. Maybe we didn't set this up correctly. Let's go back to our inventory widget and go back to our graph. Oh, we need to set this up to take in our inventory component. So over here on the left, we need to add a variable, and we will call this our inventory component. We want to change the type of it to be inventory component, like so. And for this guy, we want to set this to expose on spawn and edit instable. And so that way, like I was trying to do before, when we create the inventory widget, we can specify this value as well. And we can also set this to blueprint read only and private. And then we want to add one more for the tile size as well. So add another one and make it a float. And we will call it the tile size. And we want to go ahead and check those checkboxes as well. So check all those. And then inside of the initialize, we want to initialize our grid widget. So if we just delete all this because we don't need it, we can right click and say event on initialize. And we want to call our inventory grid widget. So drag this guy in. We want to call his initialize function that we just wrote. And you can see it takes in the inventory component and the tile size, which we have. So drag in the inventory component. Oops, not that one. The inventory component. And the tile size, which the tile size should be inside of this constants category as well. So I'm going to drag that up there. And this actually won't work because there's like a little, I don't know if it's a bug, but the way the engine behaves is when the initialize function gets called, the values that are passed in the expose non-spawn variables don't actually get set until the next frame. So in order to account for that, we're going to add a delay of 0, and a delay of 0 basically just delays it into the very next frame, which is what we need here. It's kind of like a little trick you can use, but that's basically what we want to do. And so now back here in our first person character, if we refresh this now, we should see our variables that we created to be exposed on spawn. And we can pass in our inventory component, which, we haven't even added that to our player yet. So add component, and we want to add the inventory component. So just like that. Sorry if I'm kind of stumbling through this. It's obviously like there's a lot of moving pieces and it's hard to like do this in a good way that isn't confusing, but I'm trying my best to explain everything here. Okay, so we added our inventory component, and you can see we need to specify our columns and our rows. So I think I used 6 by 15 in my example, but obviously you can set that to whatever you want. And so we just want to drag in our inventory component and hook it up there. And then the tile size, again, you can set to whatever you want. I think I used 50. So now let's go ahead and run this and see if this shows up. So we press play, we press I, and you can see, there we go. We have our grid showing up, and it is indeed 6 by 15. And just to kind of test it, let's change this to like 25 and then run it. And you can see now they are half the size. And if we adjust the columns, so maybe let's make it 15 by 6 instead, we run it, and there we go. So it seems like everything's working pretty well. We can change the size of the tiles, we can change the number of rows and the columns, and the inventory component is showing up on the screen. Now you'll notice one thing is that you can click the mouse and you can kind of move around the screen. We will be fixing that in the next part of this tutorial, because obviously we don't want to be able to look around like this. We want to be able to click things. But again, we'll be doing that in the next part of the tutorial. Just for right now, just make sure that it's working the same as it's working in my video. And then I'm going to go ahead and set this back to 50, and then set it back to 6 by 15. And then at this point, I'm going to end part 1, and we're going to start part 2. So I'll see you guys in part 2.